gland. I was just trying to catch you guys up.
Thank you.
Okay, so pineal. Pineal gland is at the top of your thalamus, in the back of your thalamus. It's sometimes referred to as your epithalamus because it's above the thalamus. There's a part of your diencephalon. It's in the caudal area of your diencephalon, so backside. When the pineal gland exocytoses melatonin, the pinealocytes they're kind of sloppy in their exocytosis, so the plasma membrane will actually get extruded with the melatonin hormone. These remnants of the plasma protein will then get calcium attached to them. And since it's close to the pineal gland, and the pineal gland sometimes reuptakes some of these, then you'll get calcium deposits in the pineal gland, and you end up getting calcification of that pineal gland. Now, why do I mention this? Because when you know this, you can find pretty much the center of the brain by looking for this white spot when you look at an X-ray, CT scan, MRI. So calcification of the pineal gland, you know where the pineal gland is, you know what should be around it if you know your anatomy, and then you can decide, is that abnormal, is that normal, surrounding tissue. Are things being distorted to one side? If they are, maybe there's a brain tumor. Can determine that kind of thing. The melatonin itself, that secretion of that hormone, is going to control your circadian rhythms, which are your light-dark cycles, your ability to go to sleep at certain times and wake up at certain times. Beyond that, it also has a lot to do with your reproductive cycles. If it's released in high concentrations, then sperm and egg development gets suppressed. So people who are popping melatonin to help them during their travels, they're traveling all over the world, going from time zone to time zone, they pop melatonin so that in the new time zone, they can go to sleep. If they plan to be reproducing while they're consuming this excess melatonin, it's not going to happen. So you have to know the consequences of that excess melatonin.
Will you tell him that it's not good for contraception?
It's not good for contraception. It's not an efficient contraceptive mechanism. I mentioned that in another class. I don't know why she thinks you need to know that. That maybe had to do with his salmon diet. Okay, so yes, it's not an efficient contraceptive mechanism. But what it does is it inhibits the production of FSH, which recruits the stem cells for sperm production, and FSH also recruits the primordial egg follicles to then go into development during the menstrual cycle. Luteinizing hormone, which stimulates testosterone production, which drives spermiogenesis and maintains the development of sperms, and also is involved in the final maturation of the sperm. If luteinizing hormone is not there, testosterone levels are low, and your sperm production goes down, maturation process is then impeded. LH for the eggs first drives androgen production, and then later on estrogen production from scratch, so to speak. More about that next semester. So light-dark cycles, light intensity plays a big role in melatonin production. If you have increase in going out in the sunlight. You'll get suppression of melatonin secretion. You'll also have a decrease in melatonin release when you're out in the sunlight. On the mainland, you have a condition called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. People actually get depressed in the winter because of this elevated melatonin secretion. So melatonin, you want to, if you have this depression during wintertime, you could go out into the sunlight, but oftentimes it's too cold to go out there for very long. So you get an incandescent light and sit next to the incandescent light, not these fluorescent lights. It has to be the old-fashioned light bulb, and then that will work as well as sunlight. Doesn't want to turn. Okay, so, oh, I know why, because I didn't plug it in. Okay. So now you get to start 18.
Trophic means nourishing. Does that mean like psychotropic drugs, they nourish the psyche?
Psychotropic, not really, never actually looked up that term, but psychotropic means they're altering your psychological balance. So they're usually either, they usually are, I think, enhancing behaviors. So making you maybe more aggressive, more whatever. Yeah. So altering your normal behaviors, getting them to the extreme. Okay, so central endocrine organs, already defined that. This is up in your head, associated with the central nervous system. As I said, if in doubt, guess peptides, because those are the most numerous. Hydrophilic hormones that are transported in the blood will be your peptides, because they're made out of amino acids, which have a lot of charges on them and can associate with water. Catecholamines, which are made out of tyrosine. This tyrosine modification is hydrophilic. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine will be your catecholamines. Indolamines are serotonin and melatonin. These are made from tryptophan, and that's another amino acid. So those also will have charges on them, so they can associate with water. The lipophilic hormones their derivation is from cholesterol. So they're going to be having a large fat component to them, and they'll need to then have transport proteins because they're lipophilic and can't associate with water molecules. The exception is thyroid hormone. I told you that thyroid hormone, although it's made from tyrosine, when they get stuck together, somehow this makes that molecule lipophilic and hydrophobic. So thyroid will have its own transport protein in the blood. The regulation, or why you have endocrine secretions, is to back up the nervous system. So the nervous system doesn't get fatigued, having to run your body all the time. The nervous system can stimulate the release of these hormones that then go into the blood and can be present for long periods of time, weeks, maybe days to weeks. They can be in the circulation and continuing to have effects on receptors whenever they get bound to a receptor. They'll be able to regulate metabolic processes without having the expense of creating an action potential. All those ions moving across segments of neurons, you have to then redistribute those ions, and it takes energy to open the channels, and it takes energy to repolarize the membrane, so it's expensive to run your nervous system. Having hormone in the circulatory system is a pretty cheap way to continue stimulating cells. The hormones we're going to be talking about will regulate water balance, so they might be helping you to retain water when you're dehydrated, or another hormone will tell your kidneys to get rid of water when the cells perceive an actual or just a relative increase in water content in your blood vessels. And usually water is going to go with ions. So if you reabsorb ions, water will come with it. If you get rid of ions, then water will go with that. And then there are also hormones that will regulate the minerals themselves. Water will then follow the mineral reabsorption or secretion. The growth of the embryo, the growth of the newborn, up till the completion of growth is driven by your thyroid driving metabolic rate, but also things like growth hormone that are going to be specifically linked to bone, muscle, adipose growth. The reproduction, we talked just, well, you know now because I told you, and before I was corrected that I hadn't. Well, actually, I talked about FSH and LH in Martini's chapter. So control of reproduction, you have follicle stimulating hormone that will stimulate the recruitment of stem cells for sperm production, egg, and then also the luteinizing that will drive the production of your sex hormones for maintenance of sperm and egg development. Erythropoietin regulates red blood cell production. The cells that release erythropoietin are in your kidneys. So kidneys being that they're there to filter things. They can sense how much water is being filtered and trigger a system to get water reabsorbed, and they can also sense the ion concentrations and release hormones or release enzymes that will start another hormones progression that will reabsorb sodium, and that will bring with it water. So one hormone, antidiuretic hormone, specifically for water, aldosterone specifically for the reabsorption of sodium. Water and sodium are extracellular volume, so decrease in blood pressure triggers a reuptake of water and sodium from the filtrate. Get it back into the circulation, control your blood pressure. The kidneys also sense how much oxygen is in that blood and in the filtrate. And when that is lower than it should be, the cells will trigger a release of the hormone erythropoietin, and that will go to the bone marrow. More red blood cells are released into the circulation. So more red blood cells, more O2 bound, more O2 in the blood, higher the partial pressure of oxygen, then kidneys are happy, shuts off this hormone system. So erythropoietin got it back down. The circulation, we've got precursors to the ADH that controls water reabsorption. To turn on the release of ADH, you have upstream angiotensin II. That is a vasoconstrictor. So if you want to change the volume of your circulatory system, shunt you want to increase blood pressure, then constrict the blood vessels. And angiotensin 2 does that. ADH, which also causes water to be reabsorbed, has a vasoconstriction action. So angiotensin 2, which releases antidiuretic hormone, those both will vasoconstrict and alter the blood pressure. The circulation itself, routing blood from one tissue to another. Example here, if you want digestion to proceed as efficiently as possible, you want the nutrients absorbed. You want blood in the digestive system for that absorption to occur. But if you're also mounting a fight or flight response, you want the blood out in your skeletal muscle. Something's got to lose. So if you shunt the blood to your muscle, you might have severe abdominal cramps because your digestive system is trying to digest the food. If your digestive system wins, then your blood doesn't go to your skeletal muscle. You can't do a fight or flight response. So you eat a big lunch and you go swimming, you get a stomach cramp. That's because the blood went to your muscles. You're swimming along fine, but now you've got stomach cramp, you panic, you drown. If you're swimming along and your muscles cramp because the blood went to your digestive system, you panic, you drown. So you have to learn how to drown proof. You have to learn how to relax. You had a stomach cramp, relax, and don't continue swimming, and float and breathe, and the cramp will go away and you're fine. If you have a muscle cramp somewhere, relax, massage the cramp away, breathe, drown proof, breathe, drown proof. Your muscle cramp will go away, then you can slowly swim to shore and say, yeah, mommy, you were right, don't go swimming after you eat a big meal. Yeah.
Is exercising to do like a tummy cramp like that bad for you?
On land?
Anyway, is exercising with the tummy cramp when you got lots of food in there?
Oh,
Is that bad for you?
usually it's self-limiting. If the cramp gets worse, you're probably going to throw up. So then you corrected the body problem.
Okay.
What's drown proof?
Oh, you don't know that drown. You better take a basic water safety course. Drown proofing is you do a jellyfish float like that, and then you do breathe, and then you relax like that. So that's drown proofing. If you're out there 7 miles offshore when your plane crashes, it's highly unlikely that the average person is going to make it to shore trying to swim 7 miles. Probably not. So you drown proof. Hopefully your plane had a life preserver, so you don't have to drown proof. But if it didn't, then the only way that you're going to stay alive, if you have shorts on, you're kind of out of luck. You have t-shirt, you're out of luck. You have jeans on, those are really good. They get wet. Tie the legs together, and then over your head, hold the waistband together, and now you have your own life preserver. Your jeans will save your life. But short sleeve t-shirt, tank top, you're out of luck. So hopefully you have a life preserver. If you don't know how to drown proof, you have jeans that will help you. Otherwise, you're probably shark bait. Shark meat? Shark. Anyway, you're going to be consumed. Okay, this is review the different picture, but it's essentially what was covered in Martini. You've got the central organs up here that include your hypothalamus, your pituitary pineal gland on the back, and then those will regulate the release of the peripheral organs, which Sherwood will cover in chapter 19. Tell me what?
Sarah said she's always gonna wear jeans now.
Well, if you're in an airplane, you should wear jeans. If you're on a boat, you probably should wear jeans. Also wear your like this, that would be really helpful, yes. Before you go on an airplane or a boat, you should always check that there's adequate life vests for all the passengers, so you don't end up like the Titanic. The reason so many people died on the Titanic is they didn't have enough lifeboats or life vests.
I'm sure that people freeze.
Well, that too, but they could have lived a little bit longer. Because actually there were several boats in the area that could have saved them had they had the life preservers. They would have been rescued. They could have lived.
It's just when you look at Titanic, it's just that everybody's frozen. I know.
Well, Titanic, as in the movie, that's something else.
What?
The hypothalamus lies just above the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus produces releasing and inhibiting factors, which act on the pituitary's anterior lobe. It also produces ADH and oxytocin. The pituitary's posterior lobe stores and secretes these hormones. The pituitary gland lies just below the hypothalamus. The anterior lobe produces 4 hormones that stimulate other glands. It also produces prolactin and somatotropin. The posterior lobe stores and secretes ADH and oxytocin produced by the hypothalamus. The pineal gland, located in the center of the brain, produces melatonin. This hormone affects biological clocks, the overall level of activity, and reproductive cycles.
See, center of the brain. If you're going to be a radiologist, this is your favorite gland.
The bow tie-shaped thyroid gland lies in front of the trachea, just below the larynx. It produces thyroid hormones, which have roles in growth, development, and metabolic control. The 4 parathyroid glands are located on the back surface of the thyroid gland. They produce parathyroid hormone, which increases blood levels of calcium ions.
You always have 4?
No.
No. So if you're going to be a surgeon, remember that.
The thymus gland produces the hormone thymosin, which has roles in immunity.
More next semester.
There are 2 adrenal glands, one above each kidney. The outer cortex secretes cortisol and aldosterone. The inner medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine.
So what layer is missing? Said aldosterone and glucocorticoids, cortisol, corticosterone. What layer didn't he say?
It's the glomerular.
No, aldosterone is the outer one.
Oh, androgen.
The androgen one, reticulary. So there's 3 in the cortex. There's 3 once you hit puberty. And so maybe this is a child, but it looks like a little boobies there.
The islet cells of the pancreas produce insulin and glucagon, which act to maintain the concentration of glucose in the blood.
More than just that, but that's for now.
The gonads produce sex hormones. In females, ovaries produce estrogens and progesterones. In males, testes produce testosterone.
Is anybody offended when I say boobies? You are? Okay, I won't say it anymore.
Drag the text to the boxes to label these endocrine glands.
Okay, where's pineal gland?
Center of the brain.
Center of the brain. Tell me which box is the center of the brain. Top right. Okay. Pituitary gland. Second left. Thyroid gland.
Under pineal gland.
Under pineal gland. Okay. Hypothalamus. First left. Adrenal glands. Third left. By the kidneys. Okay, pancreas is by the kidneys too. Okay, bottom left. Parathyroid. Top right. Thymus.
That's correct. The hypothalamus and pituitary interact to control many of the other glands.
Now, if you were in 103, that would have gotten you 8 points. But 301, it might get you 1 point. Okay, back to you. Okay, so what is a trophic hormone? Hormone that releases another hormone, yes. So give me an example of the regulatory hormone that causes TSH to be released. TRH, so thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so TSH is also a tropic hormone. It will cause thyroid hormone to be released. So if we had, instead of thyroid stimulating hormone, we have ACTH. What is the regulatory hormone that causes ACTH release? Yeah, something RH. Not ARH. CRH. Okay, so ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's going to the cortex. You have to know what part of the cortex, of course. But adrenal gland, adrenal cortex. Tropic means it's going to release a third hormone, which is going to be cortisol. Okay. So hormones can be controlled by plasma concentrations. They can be controlled by plasma concentrations of themselves by negative feedback. They can also be controlled by other things. So if I wanted to get you to tell me about glands that control calcium concentrations, what gland is going to respond to high calcium concentrations? Calcitonin is the hormone. The gland is where the calcitonin is secreting cells. Thyroid. So gland is thyroid, calcitonin from the what cells?
C cells.
C cells. Easy. Okay, so what gland is responding to low calcium? Parathyroid, and the hormone is, which stands for parathyroid hormone. Okay, so what would be removing hormones from the circulation?
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. So I understand.
That will turn off hormone release, some hormone release, not all hormone release.
A diuretic, right?
Maybe. Hormones, depends on the size of the hormone, whether it could get filtered or not. Degradation by enzymes. So hydrophilic enzymes, right away they could be attacked by enzymes. Hydrophobic, they're on a transport protein, so they're not going to be attacked until they're off the transport protein. So half-life of hydrophilic is going to be short. Half-life of hydrophobic will be longer. The removal could also be, like you said, kidneys could be filtering things away. It could be taken up by the liver and excreted that way. So the enzymes would inactivate them from their metabolic activity, then kidneys and liver could excrete them. And then you can also affect plasma concentration by peripheral activation of the glands. So you're stimulating hormones. So you have less stimulating hormone, then less hormone production. And then, as I said, if you're hydrophobic and you're bound to a plasma protein, that prolongs the life of the enzyme. As long as it's on its transport, protein can't be attacked by enzymes. So the disorders that arise from the endocrine system can be because you have too low a concentration of the hormone, and therefore the activity of the cells is too low, and too much of the circulating hormone, and then the cell's activity is too high. The cells themselves have a protection against this, and what is that? Well, yes, but the cell itself, that's something from the outside that influences the cell. What is this? Huh? What?
Make more receptors.
Okay, for which case would you make more receptors? Okay, so can make more receptors, but actually they just upregulate receptors that are already made. So they have extra packaged down from times when there were low concentrations out there before. So they downregulated when hormones went back to normal levels. They downregulate again if the hormone is too high. The hormone gets too low for that amount of receptors, and they start moving receptors back in. They run out of receptors to upregulate, then they start making more receptors. So cells will protect against their overstimulation or understimulation by moving receptors in and out of the plasma membrane. Too little hormone, it could be due to hyposecretion of the gland that's releasing of that particular endocrine gland. So hyposecretion of the thyroid gland, hyposecretion of the adrenal gland. If T3 and T4 are low, and TSH and TRH are high, then what's the problem? It's the thyroid gland. Because the low concentration of T3s and T4s, that feedback to the hypothalamus triggers an increase in TRH. The feedback to the anterior pituitary increases TSH release, but the TSH is not getting the thyroid to do what it's supposed to do. So what's the cause of this hypothyroidism? Well, yeah.
What causes that?
What causes that?
It's not being stimulated by TSH, it's not receiving it.
What happens is it's too much.
Or maybe it's not producing it.
There's a lot of talk
Either
going
you're
on.
gonna have some kind of, either you're gonna have some kind of goiter,
Yeah, some kind of goiter.
or cancer.
Cancer, maybe not. Hold that thought for this side. Okay, so you have a primary problem. It is in the gland that is releasing, in this case, thyroid. Okay, so it could be that the cells are not capable of producing thyroid hormone because there is no iodine to iodinate thyroid. It has to be T3 or T4 to get out of the thyroid gland. So if there's inadequate iodine, then the collagen just gets building up more and more, and the thyroid enlarges, cells are working harder, but they're not producing the thyroid hormone. It also can be that something messed with your TSH receptor. So you don't have the ability for TSH to bind and stay there and stimulate the cell to do what it needs to do. Maybe it's cycling on and off fast to get adequate stimulation of the follicular cell. So the target receptors, they could be lacking, or they just could be abnormal and not able to bind the TSH. And then the enzyme essential to the target cell response is going to be located where? Most hydrophilic hormones like peptides, like TSH, what are they linked to? Huh? Yeah, the hormone stays outside, so it has to bind to a receptor that's linked to a G protein. G protein coupled receptors. So the G protein will then stimulate enzyme. If the enzyme is going to be linked to protein kinase A, what is the enzyme? If it's linked to protein kinase C, what's the enzyme? Phospholipase C. Okay, so adenylyl cyclase for protein kinase A. Okay, too much activity. So cells themselves, they just pull receptors out of the membrane. So that would be, maybe you have now a tumor somewhere that's overproducing your hormone. So you've got excess cells, even without anything, very little stimulation, they get overproduction of the hormone, so hypersecretion. If there's a reduction in plasma proteins that bind certain hormones for transport, then there's an increase in free hormone, and that is then, if it's not attacked and broken down by the enzymes, it's in too high a concentration for the receptors to handle. So they probably downregulate, but in the short term, they'd be overstimulated. So it's the free hormone that's biologically active, and that's what the cells are responding to. So if you don't have the transport proteins to bind these hormones, there's more that are free than there's more that are physiologically active. So even though the absolute amount of hormone hasn't increased, because the unbound is increased, then you have the cells considering this a hyper secretion. What would cause a decrease in plasma binding proteins? Cholesterol is not going to make transport proteins for lipophilic. You can't. You could bind lipid to lipid, sure, but it wouldn't help you at all. Where are proteins coming from? Well, but in what cells and what organ? What makes the majority of your plasma protein? Well, ribosomes make the proteins, but these are located in cells in what organ? Liver. Okay, if you got kidney problems, if you've got liver problems, you might have a problem with producing plasma proteins that bind your hormone. It also means that you're going to have decreased excretion of those hormones. If your kidneys are shutting down, your liver is shutting down, then they're not going to be able to remove these hormones, and they're going to stay in circulation longer. So decreased inactivation, that could be due to enzyme inactivation, metabolically degrading them.
Of course. Why is it that the free one is biologically active?
Because you can bind to the receptor.
Oh, because I thought the transport protein had to carry it along and hand it off to the receptor.
It doesn't hand it off. It's cycling, the hormone is always cycling on and off the transport protein. But if there's adequate transport protein, when it leaves one, it gets onto another. If there's a lot of free, it's more than likely going to bind if there are transport proteins available. So only when the it's off the receptor and off the transport protein in the vicinity of the receptor, then it's gonna be able to bind to the receptor. So it has to be off the transport protein or it can't fit onto the receptor. That's why it's referred to as biologically active, because it can bind to its receptor. Okay, so upregulation and downregulation, this is the cell's own protection against hyper and hyposecretion of the hormones. Some hormones are going to be designated as permissive. So we had an example in Martini where liver releases somatomedins on the stimulation of the growth hormone. So growth hormone goes to the liver, stimulates somatomedin release. The two then go to have the effects of growth hormone on tissue. So somatomedin permits growth hormone's action. So it's a permissive hormone. Synergism, this is where you release maybe 1, 2, or 3 things that all have similar effects on a particular tissue or a particular concentration of something in the blood. So synergism is when you have 3 things or 2 things. When you have one by itself, you have X amount of response. When you have the second one by itself, you have X amount of response. So in a synergistic situation, if hormone 1 has the effect of increasing metabolic activity one-fold, and hormone 2 does the same. So you'd expect that if you had both of them together, the effect would be to raise metabolic activity twofold. But it's not the case. So in synergism, 1 plus 1 could be 3 or more. It could be 3, 4, 5 times the effect. And then if you have 3 things that work together, instead of 1 plus 1 equaling 3, it might be 7 to 10 times the effect. So the sum of the parts are greater than the combined effects that you would expect from each alone. That's synergism. And then we talked about antagonism, where one hormone wants to do something, like raise blood calcium, and the other hormone wants to lower blood calcium. So you have antagonistic effects. Calcitonin wants to lower blood calcium, but PTH wants to increase blood calcium. We have another example. Insulin wants to do what to glucose in the blood? What? Decrease it. And what wants to increase it? Glucagon. So those are antagonistic hormones. Plasma concentration of cortisol. So this is noontime, this is midnight, noontime, midnight, from day to day. The yellow for when sunlight, the blue for when it's dark. The cortisol levels are highest right at sun up, and then they decrease throughout the day, and then around midnight they start to increase again, and then they decrease throughout the day. So they have kind of a circadian rhythm of their own. So exactly why this happens, I can't say for sure. I don't know if they've actually come to any conclusion, but some people have said, well, cortisol helps you handle stressful situations. So getting up in the morning, getting ready to get up in the morning, you get your cortisol levels up high to handle the stressful events of the oncoming day. And then as you go through the day and you're having less and less stress, you come home, you relax, you eat dinner, and then you go to sleep, then the first part of your sleep cycle, maybe from 8 to midnight or 10 to midnight, your cortisol levels are low, and then you're preparing again for the next day. So it kind of makes sense. I don't know if they research people who stay up all night, like 36, 48 hours at a time, and you're pulling shifts in medicine. Sometimes you're on call and you just don't have time to sleep. If you're working on your dissertation, you don't have time to sleep for around 36, sometimes 48 hours. But you push through because cortisol helps you with that stressful situation. Cortisol does go up. Does a secretory pattern actually change rhythms? I don't know, but cortisol levels do go up. So being stressed out in school with exams, your cortisol level is higher than, it's probably higher at its peak and higher at its nadir as well in response to this. And one of the ways you know that cortisol is high is you start getting sick all the time because cortisol suppresses your immune system. And also it makes connective tissue weaker, so you get muscle, joint, and other aches and pains from normal everyday activities. Hypothalamus stimulates the release of anterior pituitary hormones. So TSH stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4. That increases generalized metabolic rate all over the body. ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex, to the zona fasciculata, and you release cortisol, which then helps with stressful situations. The growth hormone first has to go to the liver and get the insulin-like growth factor, that's your somatomedin, that's another name for somatomedins. They go together to bone, muscle, and adipose tissue and other organs and stimulate the development of them muscle-wise and size-wise. So IGF is permissive, and liver is releasing the IGF. Growth hormone cannot have its effect without IGF. The gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates LH and FSH release. LH will promote estrogen production in the female, testosterone production in the male. FSH recruits stem cells for spermiogenesis. Your female already is born with all these stem cells having progressed already into a primordial follicle stage, and those will then be recruited maybe 4 or 5 per menstrual cycle to then go into development.
Adrenaline makes the heart beat faster. The lungs work harder. The body is shouting, "Escape, escape." Victims often struggle with people trying to save them. At the same time, the brain releases a surge of pain-killing hormones, endorphins. These are so powerful that you can have a limb blown off and feel nothing.
I've literally gone numb from the waist downwards. You've just gone through your pain barrier.
After a while, however, the effects of these hormones start to wear off. The heart slows down, blood pressure drops. Clots form. Blood drains away from all but the most essential organs. The body cools and starts the long process of self-repair.
Okay, take a break.
That's the coolest video yet.
Coolest